Thank you. I thank the SB College for this invitation. I know it was at a short notice, but I agreed. I know the college. I've been there, as somebody very kindly mentioned, my visit to the college in 2017. Yes, I know the college, and I'm happy to be back with you at this meeting, though at a short notice. So I will make my presentation now. Yeah, sorry. Before that, I must say I was very impressed to hear about Professor C.O. Abraham, who must have been a great teacher. I mean, about whom I think his students spoke so eloquently. So it's it's very nice that the college is having a memorial lecture in his honor, and his students speak so fondly about him. It's very nice that a college remembers its teachers. That's very nice. So I'm happy to join the college in this memory of Professor C.O. Abraham. Okay. So the title of my lecture is Post-COVID Economic Growth Challenges. COVID-19 pandemic is truly a global health shock. By now, a lot about it is common knowledge. Yet, we do not know enough how the pandemic is likely to pan out in the days to come. Newer variants of the virus are being discovered in many countries. How the health pandemic is likely to end is still very uncertain. Since February this year, there is a resurgence in the cases in the country, and partial lockdowns reimposed in many states like Maharashtra and Punjab. Sorry, can you hear me? Can you see the?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. See, this is the graph of the pandemic since it started from 4th of March last year. You can see since February this year, there's an uptick. There's an increase in the number of cases. This is an all India picture. It shows the threat of the virus is still very much with us. There are, however, some hopeful signs of getting under control the virus with the vaccination drive. Access to vaccine is very uneven across the world, especially in poor countries. In India, as on March 21st, 3.3% of the population got at least one dose of the vaccination. There is considerable variation across Indian states, with Kerala leading the vaccination tally. Yeah, here are two graphs. It shows the vaccination drive across the Indian states. Pleasantly, Kerala is at the top with 6.45% of the population vaccinated. And as expected, I mean, unfortunately, Bihar is at the other end of the spectrum. And across the world, how does India rank? India doesn't rank too badly. Here is a picture for major Asian economies. You can see that China has done exceptionally well, vaccinating 5.4% of population so far. India is somewhere half that number, 2.9. Indonesia is just close behind. Right. So therefore, in absolute terms, what India has done doesn't look very good, but in a comparative perspective, India is done better than many Asian countries, but certainly behind China. However, the economic costs of the pandemic are far more clearer. They are devastating indeed. As per the World Bank's latest, that is January this year, estimates, during the calendar year 2020, global economic output has shrunk by 4.3% over the previous year, far worse than that during the global financial crisis of 2008. The output contraction is perhaps closer to what was witnessed during the Great Depression of the 1930s. By official accounts, India has coped with the pandemic relatively well, with the number of positive cases and deaths reported being modest related to the population size. The government takes credit for the positive outcome and is proud of rolling out domestically developed and produced vaccines. India is a dominant producer of vaccines in the world and is prepared to help the world with supply of vaccines, called the vaccine diplomacy in popular media. Roughly a year ago, on March 24th, 2020, in response to the rapidly spreading virus, India imposed an economic lockdown at 4 hours notice. The suddenness of it caused enormous disruption to production, hardship to workers and population at large. Expectedly, there was a sharp contraction in output. In April-June quarter of 2020, that is during the peak of the lockdown, India lost nearly a quarter of its output as per IMF estimates. The figure is given below. Yeah. Percentage growth rate in April-June quarter 2020. Actually, the country names are not fully mentioned. It has got erased while copying. But the largest decline you see in the rightmost bar is India's, which is about 25% of decline. For the calendar year 2020, India's GDP is estimated to have contract or shrink by 9.6% as per the World Bank report in January. Only two major countries seem to have fared far worse than India. They are Argentina and Mexico. Economic survey presented last month reported estimated output contraction in real terms to be 7.7% during the financial year 2021, that is ending this month, compared to the previous year, that is 2019-20. However, official sources are optimistic about a V-shaped recovery with a projected GDP growth rate of 10% in the next fiscal year, that is 21-22. This translates to about 2% rise in GDP compared to the pre-COVID year, that is 2019-20. So if we ignore the pandemic year and compare the pre and the post-COVID year's growth rate, then it's just about 2%. I mean, that's important. I mean, that's impact on labor market. India, in a country like India, where nearly 50% of domestic output is produced in the informal or unorganized sector, employing 90% of workers, either as self-employed workers, often working with household labor, or wage workers, the abrupt lockdown was a disaster. Workers lost their jobs and livelihoods. Over 10 million migrant workers went back to their villages after the lockdown, as per the official statement made in the parliament recently. This is the official estimate, but the unofficial estimates are much higher, but we really do not know the numbers because there are no proper ways of counting the migrant workers in India. So by many accounts, the official estimate is a gross underestimation. Okay. Migrant workers and their families walked literally hundreds of miles to the safety of their villages. Unfortunately, there is little official credible information on the plight of these workers. Yeah, in fact, I was just going to mention, recently there is a nice documentary in Disney Hotstar by Vinod Kapri on the journeys of migrant workers on their cycles from Ghaziabad in UP near Delhi to Bihar after the lockdown. It's a very nice. I mean, I would encourage the participants to view this documentary film, which is about an hour-long documentary, which is titled 1232 kilometers. It's a distance from Ghaziabad to their village in Sasaram in Bihar. And these workers cycle the distance. And the documentary filmmaker, follows them through the entire journey. So it's a very heart-rending documentary. I suppose one can have a look at it. It's an interesting documentary to see how the hardships borne by these workers. And last month there was a nice report from the ground in the newspaper Live Mint. This is a business daily coming from the Hindustan Times Group, which carried a field survey of a town called Araria in North Bihar, close to Nepal border, describing how migrant workers who returned to their villages after the lockdown are still struggling to make their ends meet. They are setting up retail stores by selling their land and property with modest sales and huge debt burden. And the reporter finds that the only business that is apparently booming in the town is the sale of quote unquote cough syrup, a euphemism for illicit alcohol and drugs. So the condition of these workers who have went back to their villages is pathetic. There is very little account of what is the status of these 10 million workers. Unfortunately, government has been reluctant to admit the gravity of the crisis caused by the sudden lockdown. However, it has claimed credit for preventing large-scale deaths due to the virus. But the official claims seem questionable. Data put out by IMF in October last suggests otherwise. As per a tweet of Professor Kaushik Basu, India's death rates per million population is among the highest in South Asian or Asian countries, 8.83 per million population. This is estimates presented by IMF, and I hope they are comparable across countries. So this picture is very serious, but the official picture is very different from this. So the point of giving all this information is that the pandemic and the lockdown caused enormous disruption to people and their earnings and livelihoods. This and a large number of deaths, but unfortunately, government has been ignoring the plight of these workers. And just to give a reference, the 10 million people walking back to their villages is comparable to, or this is next only to the migration India experienced at the time of partition of India in 1947. So this is the gravity of the migration, but somehow the rulers of this country seem to conveniently ignore this humanitarian crisis. They simply attribute it to the act of God. Okay, this pandemic and the lockdown came on top of economic slowdown, which has happened over almost the entire last decade. Yeah, the pandemic and economic crisis rubbed salt on the wounds of the long-standing growth slowdown during the decade of 2010s. Annual GDP growth rate, net of inflation, declined from 7 to 8% in 2011-12 to 4.2% in 2019-20. 1920 is the year before the lockdown. The growth estimates are suspect on account of serious methodological disputes in the recent revision of the National Accounts Series. As you know, as students of economics, many of you might have read that the GDP revision, which happened around the middle of last decade, around 2015, had many issues, and there have been many questions raised about the veracity of the GDP estimates. Many people have argued that the estimates are probably overestimates. The real growth rate during this period is probably much lower than the official growth rate. So, so the official number of 7 to 8% growth rate is probably an overestimate. Okay, that's the. There are reasons to believe that this is true. I'll mention some of them. The slowdown during the last decade is accompanied by unprecedented collapse of fixed investment and savings rate by 7 to 8 percentage points of GDP. The decade of 2010s witnessed job loss growth as against jobless growth previously. For the first time since India started nationwide measurement of employment and unemployment in 1972-73, India lost jobs in manufacturing sector 3.5 million workers lost jobs between 2011-12 and 17-18. These are official estimates made by the National Sample Survey Organization. A decline in output growth and collapse of investment resulted in a rise in poverty rates and denting child nutrition status between 2015-16 and 19-20. This is reasonable to expect. If there are no jobs, if there's no income, obviously people have less money to consume, and hence it's natural to expect poverty to have increased and child undernutrition must have increased. So it stands to reason that these changes have happened. Here are the graphs. There are 4 or 5 graphs I'll show. This is the GDP growth rate between 2012-13. It is the annual GDP growth rates net of inflation. It is the blue line is official numbers. And you can see that in the last period, 2020-21, it has simply collapsed, which is expected because of the pandemic and lockdown. And even earlier, there's a kind of an inverted U-shaped curve of growth rate. But this is questioned by people who have sought to make alternative estimates, people like Arvind Subramaniam or Sebastian Morris, who have tried to give alternative estimates. They believe it is something like between 4 and 4.5% during this period. So this is the difference between what the officials claim and what the critics think is the true growth rate. Okay, and more significantly, the saving investment ratio has collapsed. For me, this is very significant because in the last 7 decades since 1950, never have we experienced such a dramatic decline in investment rate and savings rate. As students of economics, we know that savings, investment, and growth are highly related. Unless there is a rising investment rate, savings rate, and rising investment rate, one cannot expect rising output growth. This is very, very, very commonsensical for a student of economics. Okay, so if in 2000s, between 2002, 3, and 7, 8, when the economy boomed, what I have called the India's dream run, when India was growing at 7 to 8% and was close behind China, our savings and investment rates were close to 40%, 38, 34, 37%. And unless an economy has that levels of savings and investment rates, economy cannot grow at 78%. And what we have noticed in the last decade, that is 2010s, is a steady decline in all the indicators, that is savings and investments and fixed investment. Okay, so this clearly shows that economy has not been doing too well before the pandemic. And other indicators, exports, as you know, the boom, the dream run which we experienced in the first decade of the present century was export-led growth. We had seen a huge increase in exports. We know that IT exports were the driving force for the export boom. But in the last decade, one can see both exports and imports as a proportion of GDP have simply declined. Okay, so expectedly, when incomes are going down, poverty rates have increased. This is again official data between 93, 94 and 2017, 18. You find that the total poverty which was declining secularly, has increased somewhat here, and increase is more in rural poverty from 25% to 29%. Okay, so all this follows from poor economic growth. Okay, so this in these 4 graphs in way tell you the picture of Indian economy before the pandemic. Okay, response to the crisis. Globally, the health crisis is seen as a sudden contraction in aggregate demand, especially consumer demand, and the employer's inability to pay wages. Expectedly, when the production stops, nobody has money, so even the wage payment stops. Therefore, the consumption stops. Most governments across the world, regardless of their political leanings, have expanded public expenditure to support incomes and livelihood. This has increased public debt to GDP ratios, breaching fiscal deficit targets. And in times like these, it is widely accepted that's the correct response to the crisis. When there is no income, there is no demand in the economy, the government, by simply borrowing or printing money and expanding demand, is a right strategy, as economics teaches us. Okay, but India's response was somewhat different. India's response to the crisis has been quite different, however. In May last year, amid the deep economic contraction and widespread criticism of inaction by the government announced a 20 billion rupee Atmanirbhar Bharat economic package to address the crisis. A close reading of the package showed that most of the package increased credit supply, credit guarantees, but very little rise in public spending to hold up domestic demand. So this is the core of the problem with the government's claim to support the people in times of the crisis. Instead of putting money in the hands of the people, what government was doing was giving credit to eligible borrowers to borrow and produce more. But who would want to borrow more when there is no demand for the output that is being produced, or when there are supply constraints because of the lockdown? Okay, so there are no takers for the credit which the government was liberally offering. Okay, so increased public spending on account of the government package is estimated to be in the range of 0.9% to 1.5% of GDP by various estimates. Okay, this is minuscule compared to what other countries have done. I mean, just to give you an idea, in countries like US and Canada, every eligible citizen were given cash support ranging from $600 per week to $2,000 per month. In Canada, $600 per week in US and up to $2,000 per month in Canada. So this is how those countries sought to cushion the population who lost their jobs with income support. Okay, so what India did was one of the worst quantum of fiscal support offered by any major country in the world, as reported by Moody's Analytics. Okay, here is the graph. Kindly have a look at this. This is India's response to the crisis. Fiscal support as a percentage of 2019 GDP. It is source is Moody's Analytics. I have borrowed this from Greg Mankiw's blog post. Okay, it shows the kind of look at compare it with say US and India. US support, including the most recent one, which happened this month, is almost coming to about 24% of GDP. This is fiscal support. Okay, look at other countries. Okay, India is about 1%. Okay, so this is the range of support provided. India's poor response is appalling. Okay, despite much verbal support, government's current and capital expenditures have hardly moved up in the first 8 months of the year 2021. In fact, the latest national accounts quarterly results, which showed it had data on government expenditure during the first 8 months of the current fiscal year compared to the corresponding period last year. And there is, when you look at the numbers, there's hardly any increase in government expenditure. I mean, this may come as a surprise to listeners because government makes lots of announcements and mostly in absolute rupee terms. So many thousands of crores have been given support for various items of expenditure, but they do not add up in the aggregate to an additional expenditure. If they have given support for some program, they have cut expenditure somewhere else about which they do not often mention. This is the reason why, if you look at the national accounts, which provides the account of the nation, one finds that the government has really not increased its expenditure during the first 9 months of the current fiscal year. So that is the problem which many economists like me have been flagging, that this is the poor response of the government to the crisis which we are facing this year. Okay. Instead, what government has done? What government has done is structural reforms. The pandemic and lockdown led to a collapse in aggregate demand as wages and income shrunk. But the government sought to improve conditions of long-term supply by undertaking structural reforms. Instead of focusing on demand, government was focusing on long-term supply. Okay, direct employment creation efforts of the support displaced workers and everyone was very modest. Okay, that's the crisis. I mean, compare this with just imagine. I'm sure you have been following the change in the U.S. presidents, and then how the new president, President Biden, has taken great efforts to see that the money is pumped into the economy, especially in the hands of those who do not have jobs, and especially for children. Children are supposed to be suffering very badly in the US on account of pandemic, and grants are given to families with children. So this is how the world's richest economy is supporting its population. Whereas world's one of the poorest countries, India is may not be the poorest, one of the poorest. Okay, is refusing to support its own people. I mean, that's the cause of concern as an economist for me. Okay. Border skirmishes with China during last year, during the month of May or June, I guess, made India realize its import dependence on that country. In response to the external threat, government initiated Atmanirbhar package self-reliance agenda. The health pandemic also revealed India's limited domestic manufacturing capacity of critical items such as bulk drugs and fertilizers. Prime Minister called for Atmanirbhar Bharat during the lockdown, reiterated it in his Independence Day's address. Seems a tacit admission of growing external economic threat. Government sought to incentivize domestic production of mobile phones and electronic hardware by production-linked incentives to achieve self-reliance in manufacturing. More significantly, government perceived an opportunity during the pandemic and lockdown to bring about major changes in economic laws without parliamentary scrutiny and oversight. The ongoing agitation against the new farm laws are a response to the reforms initiated during the pandemic. Similarly, the government passed changes in labor laws, about which we still to see the full effect. Currently, the government is busy framing rules to implement the new labor codes by April. On the face of it, the new labor codes offer flexibility to employers to deploy workers to meet the changing requirements of production and extend social security benefits to informal workers. Okay, and one can't disagree with such ideas. However, the reality of the reform seemed far graver. In the name of flexibility, workers' right to wages, overtime payment, and weekly paid leave as per the Factories Act 1948 seem to be curtailed. I underline the word seem because the actual rules are still being framed. From whatever we have been hearing and whatever has been made public, this seems to be the case. Apparently, the new rules are out of line with the ILO mandate to which India is a signatory. In fact, during the pandemic, the UP government sought to pass an ordinance to abrogate the labor laws in line with the new labor codes. The ILO came down sharply on the state government and the ordinance was withdrawn. To provide greater flexibility to employers, the labor codes proposes fixed term contracts for workers in place of permanent jobs. However, labor code does not specify how long the fixed term would last. See, just to give some context, in the industrial sector, it is widely believed that the permanent job situation in industrial sector makes it hard for employers to use the labor flexibly. Therefore, the employers have been clamoring for a flexible labor contracts. And the fixed term contract is seen as a way out of the problem. And fixed term contracts are apparently operate in countries like China and Vietnam. But in those countries, workers have a fixed term for only 2 fixed terms. Fixed term of two years each. And so after a period of 4 years, the company will have to absorb them and make them permanent. So one cannot keep a worker on fixed term forever. But in Indian laws, what is made available so far, it doesn't seem to be the case. There is no clarity on what this fixed term is really about. Okay. In other words, the labor law reform effectively do away with the job security for industrial workers. If this is the real agenda, then it's a serious regression of labor rights, and I'm sure this will come up in due course in political arena. Okay. The new codes make it much harder for workers to call strike. Power of labor courts seemed curtailed with greater role for administration in overruling industrial courts. This seems somewhat similar to what is being proposed in the new farm laws, where power of the local judiciary is curtailed in favor of bureaucracy. In other words, if you have followed the ongoing farmers' agitation, mostly concentrated in Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP, the new farm laws give greater greater power to the local bureaucracy to overrule the courts in adjudicating the farm-related matters. In other words, the local courts or local mandis, the regulated markets, have the role reduced in the new law and the new farm laws. Similarly, in the new labor codes, the role of labor courts is reduced and the power of local bureaucracy is increased. So, in other words, the institutional mechanism we have to sort out the capital labor relations in industrial sector is changed in favor of the enterprises against the interest of workers. Okay. Industrial violence at the Taiwanese Wistron iPhone assembly factory in Karnataka about 3 months ago is an early example of conflicts that are likely to emerge when the new labor codes get implemented. So you might have read in newspapers that in the month of November, the iPhone assembly factory went on strike. I mean, there was a violence and the factory was shut down. Okay, because basic labor laws were violated. Okay, and apparently the factory has been reopened. It has to see how the new codes pan out. So I'm only raising an issue which is likely to come up in future, which is the effect of the changes in labor laws or structural reforms which the government has introduced during the pandemic without adequate consultation the stakeholders and without proper approval in the parliament. Okay. So critique of structural reform. This is important. Why many economists feel structural reforms are not something which are right at the moment. What are structural reforms? They work on the supply side of the economy by tackling obstacles to the efficient and fair production of goods and services. They should help increase productivity, investment, and employment. This is an official definition as given by the OECD. In other words, structural reforms may help growth when the economy is constrained from the supply side. The economy is currently suffering from the problem of aggregate demand. So in principle, the reforms are unlikely to be helpful in the present circumstances. This is a view which many economists have taken. The underlying idea behind structural reform is that excessive state intervention is holding back private sector's efforts to increase supply. But in the current situation, the problem is from the demand side, as we have mentioned. Hence, the reforms may not be helpful in getting the economy out of its current poor output growth path. So the point one is saying is this, that in a situation when you have an acute aggregate demand problem, structural reforms have very little place. Structural reforms may be required in a situation when there are supply bottlenecks caused by government regulation. But today the problem is not that. The problem is from the demand side. So that is at the core of I would say, the debate or the dispute between the government's efforts to bring about changes after the pandemic and the economists who have been claiming that this is a ill thought out package of reforms. So in this context, what does the budget propose? Yeah, before that, I have not mentioned here, I have written about it. So in this context, what should the government do? What should the government do? In my view, there are three things required. One is that to overcome the pandemic, India requires to make massive investment in public health facilities. Okay. A public health facility, I do not mean just increase in vaccination and supply of vaccination to everyone, but I think India suffers from an acute shortage of public health facilities, basically primary health care centers and hospitals and basic facility like drainage, sewerage, drinking water. So as you know, a lot of infectious disease spread in India, including the pandemic, when the basic hygiene is not there. Basic facilities for people to clean themselves and clearing of the waste, the human waste. Unless these are there, the infectious disease will continue to prevail. Public health investments are meant to remove this infectious disease. I think Kerala is an exception in the country where it has made the investments and therefore it has overcome the basic problem of public health. But the rest of the country suffers acutely from this. So as a first step overcome the present crisis, my argument was that India should use this as an opportunity to expand investments in public health facilities. This is something which most medical professionals have argued, or public health professionals have argued. That is the first requirement. Second requirement I said is that the 10 million workers who lost their jobs or have been migrant workers who have been walking back to their villages, they need help to get back their consumption levels and improve their earnings and livelihood facilities. That's a second thing. Third point which I have made is that to overcome the long-term decline in economy, we have seen that during the last decade, India has to step up public investments. because private investment is not able to do the job, because private investment is mired in bad debt, and banks are mired in non-performing assets, which means that they're bad loans. The loans are not giving them return. So the banking sector is not willing to step up loans to private sector again. In such situation, when the investments are declining as a percentage of GDP, the way out of it is public investment should be used to revive the investment activity in the economy. So these are the three proposals I have made in a paper. So as against this, what has the government proposed in the budget? On the face of it, there is a directional change in the budget with respect to public investment and fiscal orthodoxy to boost growth. The finance minister said the government will borrow an additional 80,000 crore rupees for the purpose in the next 2 months. For the purpose means for the purpose of making public investments. The estimated fiscal deficit for the fiscal year 21-22 is estimated to be 6.8% of GDP for the central government. And the state governments are allowed higher fiscal deficit if the expenditure is on capital investment. All this sounds very nice for me, because this is what I have argued for a long time to revive the economy. Okay. Second point about the budget is there is a 137% rise in health expenditure, which is again music to my ears. In light of what I just now said about what I think should be done. Okay. But unfortunately, there is very little support for jobs and livelihoods. The government, the budget hardly makes a mention of the crisis in jobs and the livelihoods. Okay. The reality check, as you know, budgets are basically political statements. Of intentions of with obviously with elections around the corner, the budget are more political statements than other times. Okay. And we also know that budgets are like the financial statements, where the real final points are hidden in the fine print. They are like the financial, the advertisement for the financial products, where the critical items are hidden in the fine print. Okay, so one should read the budget document carefully. I mean, as students of economics, we must read carefully, but also we look for the deceptive items in it. Okay, so one needs to do a reality check of the budget. So when looked closely, I found the following. The 34% rise in public investment outlined in the budget is not backed by allocation of resources, but largely contingent on realizing the following. Increased tax revenue. Budget seems to present highly optimistic estimates, as many people have commented. Disinvestment proceeds. Past record of meeting targets is very poor. Okay, this is something which has happened over the last 2 decades. The actual proceeds are far lower than the targets. So by saying this, I am not saying that disinvestment is desirable. I am not commenting on that need to be taken up separately. But assuming disinvestment is desirable to step up public investment, what the government proposes, is it reasonable? It doesn't seem to be the case. The targets are too high, and it's unlikely to be met. Okay. Third point, which is a new item in the government agenda, is sale of rail and road assets, a completely new ball game. These assets are mostly under implementation under public-private partnership mode, PPP mode, whose property rights and contingent liabilities are hazy. Hence, selling such public assets will be Herculean task, if at all possible. Okay. So government's ability to raise resources from the market, from the capital market, without raising interest rates, for the private sector will also be a challenge. So the point I'm trying to say is that the government's proposed increase in public investment is contingent on these four items, all of which look extremely over-optimistic. Even assuming that they're desirable. I'm not questioning the desirability point. I'm only saying, even if they're desirable, what the government proposes look extremely optimistic. So I'm not sure whether the government's proposal in the budget of boosting public investment is likely to happen. That is my assessment. Okay. The last point I mentioned, the government's ability to raise resources from the market without raising interest rate. This requires a bit of explanation. As you know, that if the government borrows from the market, then it may, as we learn in macroeconomics, may crowd out private investment, which means that the government, when government comes in and grabs the resources, takes away resources from the market, the resources available for the private sector will be at a much higher rates of interest. Or in other words, even the intention of government borrowing such large amount from the market leads to a rise in interest rates in the market, which means that what private sector can borrow, which is economical for them, would get reduced. So this is likely to happen if the government comes into the market in a big way. Okay, to borrow. So therefore, whether government borrowing from the market leads to an expansion in overall investment growth, we do not know. Therefore, one has to be cautious that whether government's intentions will lead to the desirable results of increasing overall investment rate. Okay. Next item about the proposed increase in health outlay. It appears to me like a fudge. Simple, what the government seems to have done is amalgamation of budgets of departments of water and sanitation with health, and added one-time grant of 10,000 crore rupees by Finance Commission for states and 35,000 crore rupee grant for vaccination. So excluding these, this is all one-time expenditures. Excluding these, there is a shuffling of expenditure heads with apparently very little hike in health expenditure to strengthen public health service. So looking closely at the numbers of health outlay, one finds that there's very little increase. What the government has done is simply fudge the numbers to show a 137% increase, but in reality, there doesn't seem to be much of an increase. So in effect, government is really not increasing the health expenditure or is not expanding investment in public health as it is claiming to do. On the other hand, there's a shocking decline in allocation for nutrition by 27% compared to last year. This is shocking because in spite of the fact that child nutrition outcomes have deteriorated between 2015-16 and 19-20 in selected states for which the data has become available, there's a clear increase in child undernourishment. So the point of saying this is, while the government's headline numbers, headline agenda looks very rosy and very comforting to critics like me who have for a long time argued for increasing in public expenditure, public health expenditure, but in reality, there doesn't seem to be very much to offer in the budget in real terms. So this is my assessment of what the budget seeks to do to take care of the crisis we faced during the current year. Okay, so I am ready to budgetary disappointments. This is yeah, this is my disappointment, I would say. Sadly, the budget has very little to support 10 million migrant workers who lost jobs and livelihoods after the lockdown. I have mentioned about it. Even the economic survey this year barely mentions the plight of these workers. On the other hand, what we have noticed is a K-shaped recovery. The recovery from the pandemic appears to be K-shaped, with profits rising and wage rates and wage shares declining. This is something which has been talked about in the international discourse also. So while the government has been talking about V-shaped recovery from pandemic last year, to what has happened is the rich or the super rich in the country have gained enormously, whereas the majority of the population has suffered. So the rich have become richer and the poorer have become poorer. So that's why it is called a K-shaped recovery. In fact, if you see today, I think the Business Standard has an op-ed piece by Stiglitz, Jayati Ghosh, and one more Nobel laureate on the K-shaped recovery globally. You may want to have a look at it today. Please take a look at the Business Standard today. You will find a good piece. So this is what has happened in India as well. Okay, here is the information, the data. This is a picture from The Economist, dated 3rd December. You find that the assets of two major business houses, which are reportedly closely aligned to the present political regime, Gautam Adani and Mukesh Ambani, their assets, their net worth, net worth is assets minus liabilities. Okay, their net worth has shot up, whereas the GDP has declined. And we also know millions of workers have lost their jobs. Okay, and self-employed workers have lost their livelihoods. But the richest in the country have gained. And there's another evidence here. The rank of the richest Indian has moved up to the 12th spot on the Bloomberg Billionaire Index in January 2021, up from 40th rank a year ago. So this only shows that the pandemic has helped, or the rich or the super rich in the world, including India, have taken advantage of the crisis, and their net worth has shot up, while the whole rest of the population, okay, have lost. So this is what is a K-shaped recovery, and this is an evidence of it. Okay. This is shocking and unfortunately true. Okay. Yeah, while India's hapless migrant workers lost their toehold in the economy, why could not the budget consider a special tax on the super rich, as many countries are mooting now? In fact, if you please follow the current discussion in the US, the President Biden of the US has in fact suggested a tax on the super rich. So what I find surprising is even the world's richest and the most capitalist country is prepared to consider a tax on the super rich, whereas in India we don't even think about it. There's not even a thought about having something like this. And the world's richest country has supported its citizens with generous cash support, whereas a poor country like India has not considered that at all. So this is a sad reflection on the current economic policy making or current political economy of the country. Okay. Of course, one may say I am very naive to expect from the ruling dispensation that is doing everything to boost the animal spirits of the entrepreneurial class as a salvation for India's current. So the present ruling class is busy seeking to boost the animal spirits of the entrepreneurial class. So they do not want to touch the super rich, as they are expected to pull the economy out of the current morass. So maybe I should not be expecting such a ruling dispensation to consider taxing the rich. Okay, so this is a sad commentary on the current political dispensation. Okay, to conclude, by this time around last year, to be precise, 24th of March, economic slowdown and the lockdown was introduced. The economic slowdown was evident from all public information. Government was unwilling to admit it though. Conservative economic policy and concern of inflation was dominant. COVID-19 pandemic and economic lockdown were exogenous shocks, leading to a contraction of output close to 8% of GDP over the previous year. True, one may say that these the virus pandemic and the was an act of God, but lockdown and the lack of government support for the poor are not the acts of God. They are the acts of the policymakers. Okay, the government takes credit for minimal deaths due to the pandemic and quick output recovery. Both these claims are questionable. As I showed you, a tweet by Kaushik Basu questioned these numbers. And what India has achieved is not something out of this world. In fact, our neighboring countries have had similar health outcomes like ours. Okay. India's economic contraction is one of the worst among the major economies, barring perhaps Mexico and Argentina. The conservative economic policy has meant modest fiscal stimulus to augment aggregate demand. Most of the relief package was credit and liquidity support measures and structural reforms. These efforts, in principle, work from the supply side, whereas the real constraint now on growth is from the demand side. Okay. Increased supply and easing of terms of credit have not improved credit offtake for lack of demand. The budget has sought to boost public infrastructure investment in health and large-scale privatization as conscious efforts to veer the economy towards the ruling dispensation's ideology, minimum government, maximum governance. Yeah, I have not talked about privatization. I mean, I thought the time was not adequate. Privatization is very much on the cards, and the government is willing to privatize even the most profitable companies like BCPL. However, there is very little for the distressed migrant workers who lost their jobs and livelihoods. Shockingly, government seems insensitive to the plight of poorest, blaming the pandemic as an act of God. It is painful to realize that the nation, I'm very consciously adding this. It's painful to realize that a nation which supported 10 million refugees from Bangladesh in 1971 for about a year failed its own migrant workers now. I mean, if I remember the history correct, and I guess the people of my age in the audience may recall that there was a special tax or a special stamp of 2 paisa on every postcard, every inland letter which was posted as a tax to support the Bangladeshi migrants who came out to India during the war they had with Pakistan. So India taxed its own people to support the Bangladeshi refugees. So what surprises me and shocks me is that the present government could not do anything like that to support its own migrant workers who come to the cities, who build our homes, who build our skyscrapers, who build our malls and highways. We did not support them when they were in distress. So this really and what surprises me is that India has a history of being socially sensitive. I mean, if you recall, in 1984 we had the Bhopal gas tragedy, which is one of the worst environmental tragedies in the world. But there is an enormous outpouring of support for the people who lost who lost their lives and people who suffered in Bhopal. There's an outpouring of help from all over the country but I wonder why is it that the same society, same nation refuse to support the 10 million workers who are walking back to their villages? Has our psychology changed? Have we become more indifferent to our own people? I don't know. I have these questions for which I find no easy answers. Okay. Atmanirbhar Bharat seem to mean personal responsibility for one's condition and not national self-reliance as is widely understood. So the government seem to mean by Atmanirbhar Bharat that individuals are responsible for themselves. It is not the state which is responsible for their well-being. Is that what Atmanirbhar Bharat really means? I don't know. I mean, I'm made to rethink my notion of self-reliance. Okay. Though impressive, public investment proposals are underfunded in the budget, which are most dependent on privatization proceeds. Similarly, the seemingly impressive hike in the health outlay seems like a fudge of combining various related programs with modest increase in budgetary allocation for health per se. Budget seems high on rhetoric of initiating an investment-led economic revival, jettisoning fiscal conservatism for now, and commitment to shrink public sector. For the reasons discussed in the lecture, the response seems to fail to come up to the challenges adequately to meet the gravest health and economic crisis in post-independence India. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. There are a couple of questions that our students posted in the chat box. I'd like to read it out. So
I'm not able to, just a minute.
Sir, I can read it out for you, sir.
Can you please read it out for me?
Sure, sir. Sir, where do you feel the government should invest in order to reduce educated unemployment in the Indian economy in the pandemic scenario?
Okay, you would want to. Okay, I have. Can I answer now? Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, sir.
I have no specific suggestion on this count. I would only think that reviving economic growth will lead to increase in opportunities. I mean, that may sound too banal an answer, but it is true that economic growth has slowed down, as I showed. I mean, which is now widely accepted among economists. So, if economic growth revives, and I know that today the situation of unemployment is very acute. In fact, if you recall the boom period of the first decade of the 21st century, nobody was thinking of government jobs. Everybody thought taking the IT jobs or going abroad or various other options. But today, for lack of anything else, one finds that the government jobs are the only one after which every educated person is trying hard, because there are no private sector jobs in the offering, because the private sector investments have collapsed. Therefore, correspondingly, the employment has collapsed. Okay, so, and honestly, not that government jobs are increasing. No, the government jobs are not increasing very much. Okay, therefore, it's really hard. I mean, the situation is very hard. But the way out, as I see, is the revival of economy. Revival of the economy is the way out. And private sector, which was the engine of growth during the boom period of the first decade of the century, is not in a position to do it now. Therefore, government has to really take up the slack and invest in infrastructure, investment in strategic industries. Today, we have become extremely dependent on China for fertilizers, for pharmaceuticals, okay, and of course the electronic hardware. Unless government has a strategy to substantially increase investments, jobs will not be created. So I don't think, I mean, that's where I've been focusing on investments, but there's very little actual investment. Say program I can see in the horizon. That's my cause of concern, and I think that's a way. That's the only way out for educated unemployed at this moment. That's my answer now.
Okay, so thank you, sir. The second question is again by Milan. He asks, sir, how to boost the savings in the economy when the incentives and possibility to save is decreasing due to increase in both direct and indirect taxes?
See, savings. See, to say that the direct and indirect tax have increased, I am not so. See, what has been happening is a lot of rationalization has happened. If you look at the aggregate tax to GDP ratio, both for direct or indirect, they have not increased very much during the last few years. So the notion that there's a great increase in taxes is not true. In fact, the idea of GST in theory was that it will plug lots of loopholes which are there in the indirect tax system and increase the savings, the tax rates, and hence the national savings rates. Okay, not by increasing the rates as much as plugging various loopholes. But we know that GST has been very poorly implemented, and therefore I don't think GST has increased the tax rates in reality. So to say that the tax rates have increased, therefore the savings are low, I'm not sure whether that really holds. What government needs to do, I think, it has to incentivize savings. See, government has to incentivize savings and depend less on foreign capital inflows. Today, our Indian stock market is completely run by FIIs. In fact, if you see the stock market booming, it is not because the Indian residents are putting their money and playing in the stock market. Very little of it. In fact, it has become a plaything for foreign capital. Okay, so therefore, and instead, the government can have schemes to increase domestic savings, which the government, I don't think, has attempted. Okay, I don't know whether it answers the query. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, sir. There is Ritu from the audience. He wants to ask a question.
Please.
Good evening, sir. So you explained about how the government is working through the supply side rather than going for demand side policies. So before the pandemic situation, we had our debt to GDP ratio about between 70 and 72%, somewhere there. And to my limited knowledge, I have heard that the World Bank suggests that the debt to GDP ratio crossing 70s would be a great burden on the economy, especially a growing economy. So even if the government wanted to do something on the demand side, like increasing its expenditure, increasing government expenditure, definitely it would have to borrow, or definitely the GDP, the debt to GDP ratio would obviously be increasing in such a case. So so are we like trapped in such a situation that neither can we do something on the demand side, nor whatever we do on the supply side is going to be effective? So are we basically in a trapped situation?
Okay. See, the notion, I know what you're saying is, what you're saying is very widely stated positions in the public discourse. So I can understand where you are coming from. Okay, and there is this strong view in macroeconomics, and there's this famous book and a paper by American economists. Okay, which said that if the debt to GDP ratio crosses 90%, okay, the chances of financial crisis and the macroeconomic crisis increase enormously, and therefore the government should never try to cross that limit of 90%. Okay, and this was very widely propagated about 10 years ago. And you're right in saying that the entire American, or say Western economic establishment almost bought this viewpoint and pushed the view very, very widely. But what is the logic behind it? Okay, see, first of all, there's a difference between a household and a nation state. A household has to live within its means. Okay, if it borrows more than what it can repay, then it can get into solvency problems. It can get into. But a nation state is a different case. A nation which has its own currency can borrow in its own currency. Okay, the only limit to it is inflation. If you borrow too much and there are no goods in the market to support that increase in government expenditure, then it will lead to inflation. But if the borrowed money by the state, or the state borrows from the central bank, or say, let me use simple terms, say prints money, and if this printed money is used to expand output or take care of the critical shortages in the economy, okay, then output increases, and therefore inflation may not rise. Okay, so what matters with debt is what you use the debt for. Suppose, say, if you simply print money and just distribute it to people who splurge on it in a situation when there is no excess supply, okay, then it will surely translate into equivalent inflation. But in a situation like ours in now, when there are abundant food grain stocks, there is abundant foreign exchange stocks, right? World oil prices are ruling low. Okay, in such situation, if the money is spent for productive purpose, okay, which will lead to increase in supply. Okay, in such situation, the chances of creating inflation are minimal. Okay, so this is what many have argued, that it is not the debt per se which matters, but what the debt is used for. If the debt is used for conspicuous consumption, which will lead to a lot of foreign exchange imports, and if there is a shortage of foreign exchange in the country, then it will lead to external imbalance, the balance of payment crisis. Okay, but in present situation, when there are no shortages of food grains, foreign exchange, okay, and oil prices are ruling low, which is our major import, okay, then the fear of increasing government debt leading to crisis is minimal. Okay. So therefore, the fixation with the debt to GDP ratio is irrational unless one can look at it in the specific context. And moreover, this whole argument that 90% crossing the 90% limit universally leads to a crisis is open to question. There's a big academic debate about it. Right. So I think that is highly questionable. And look at the countries which have gone through it. I mean, this is what I told is a analytical argument, theoretical argument. But look at the countries which have done. How did China become a global player? See, after the 2008 financial crisis, both India and China suffered. China suffered more than India, right? Because it is a much more open, export-dependent economy. But how did they overcome the financial crisis? they stepped up domestic investment. They stepped up domestic borrowing, domestic investment. They put the money in their own economy, in creating infrastructure, creating technologies, and they have become world leaders in so many places. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we used to say China produces cheap goods. Okay, it produces only assembles the imported components. But today it's not the case. Today they produce their own products world over, and they have become the world leaders in so many areas. How did this happen? Because they had a clear industrial policy, and supported by state level, I mean the government investment banks, which pumped money into domestic production, domestic investment, and they became world leaders. And they did not suffer from inflation, right? So the notion that fiscal orthodoxy, that don't spend more than what you can afford, is a fiscal orthodoxy which has limited value for a country. It works in a situation where there is a supply constraint, okay, but not otherwise. But if government investment can relieve supply constraints, then inflationary threat gets reduced. Okay, so your question is right, but we must understand how it works, rather than simply believe that crossing some limit, it will lead to a crisis, and we have no option but to tighten our belts. No, it's not the case. Third example, I would say Japan. Japan for last 3 decades is having debt to GDP ratio of 250% of GDP. If you don't believe me, just check it out. Do a Google search, Japanese public debt. Okay, you'll see for yourself. And not for 1 year, 2 years, nearly 3 decades. But has Japan ever suffered a financial crisis? Japan's growth has slowed down for various reasons, structural reasons. Okay, but Japan has never suffered a macroeconomic crisis. Okay, because Japanese debt is owned by Japanese citizens. Okay, and they keep investing in their own government debt, and there is no crisis. Okay, so just simply going by the ratio of debt to GDP ratio as a crisis, if it crosses some limit, is questionable. Okay.
Yes, sir. Next, Martin has a question. Sir, how do you think the upcoming privatization policies will affect the Indian economy, especially the LIC IPO, when it is the market leader in the insurance market?
Good question, but I have no clear answer. First of all, it is not clear how they want to go about it. See, I'm first of all perplexed why they are doing it. I mean, assuming privatization is desirable, privatization of an enterprise producing goods and services is desirable. Okay, well, I may disagree with the view, but one may say it's all right in some circumstances. But LIC is effectively underwrites government's various activities. It's almost like I would say the underwriter of government's various macroeconomic policies. Okay, suppose say the market is down. Suppose the stock market is going down, and LIC steps in and props it up. Okay, government disinvests or privatizes some enterprise. If there are not enough takers in the private sector, LIC steps in and buys up the shares which are under offer. Okay, so LIC for several decades has been operating like a investment banker to Government of India. Okay, and its investment operations are highly opaque, and it is known between the government and LIC. Okay, and its investments are huge. Okay, across the country, across the sectors. Okay, so what does government hopes to achieve by this is unclear at all. Okay, so why would government want to give up an institution which is basically supporting its macroeconomic objectives? Okay, so it is not like selling some enterprise which produces some goods. So LIC is effectively the investment banker of Government of India. So what is government to get out of it? How much it will get? How will it do the privatization? To me, it's very unclear. Even, I mean, I tried to follow, but I have not got any clarity. Okay, so it's still very unclear to me what will happen. The only thing I can say, see, government is looking at it extremely narrowly in an accounting sense, not in a macroeconomic sense. In the sense that the government looks at only an enterprise, its costs, its profitability, what can be sold. I mean, it's basically an accountant's account, not a macroeconomic account. Okay, and therefore it says, look, you can sell 5% of shares, so its potential value is this much. So we can get so much of money. Therefore, our fiscal deficit will get reduced by this much. That's basically an accountant's account, but without thinking through what are its macroeconomic implications. I think that is the problem with thinking about LIC privatization. So sorry, my answer may not be very satisfying, but I think this is the best I could make out. I think what the government is doing is wrong, but both purely and theoretically, even in terms of practically as a strategy to, I think it's completely wrong, and that's my view.
Okay, sir. Next question is by Milan. Sir, will investing in health sector in a large scale basis would help the economy in reducing poverty, health, and unemployment issues?
Sorry, could you come again, please?
Sir, will simply investing in the health sector in a large scale basis would help the country in reducing poverty, health, and unemployment issues?
Okay. See, poverty, let's keep it serious aside. Poverty in the sense, health pandemics are, at individual family levels, are a serious problem. In fact, a lot of poor people get in and out of poverty on account of health, crisis at the family level. Suppose, say, a poor family, suddenly, the breadwinner has a heart attack, he's not able to work for 2 years, then the family's, income goes down, they go into poverty. That's, but what one is saying is the health investments. Let me tell you what is required today is public health. Okay, public health is largely has lots of positive externalities for the society. So if there's a clean drinking water available to all the citizens, then a large number of health-related disease and morbidities will go down. Similarly, if there's a clear, toilet facility with a drainage and sewerage, okay, then the health infections of health of various kinds will go down. See, there's an interesting history. In the early part of the 20th century, the world experienced what they call the public health revolution. Where, again, going back a bit again, the countries today we admire, much of continent and much of Europe, like, they were filthy cities like London, Paris, which we always look up today as the finest cities of the world. They were filthy cities, at that time. Okay, then they had various infectious disease and various, I think, pandemics. Then, around the turn of the 20th century, there's a massive public health revolution in Europe. Okay, massive investments in basically creating, providing drinking water, sanitation, drainage, sewerage, and clearing the cities out of all the garbage and filth which is there. And I'm putting it very simply. Okay, that's what they did. And within 50 years, those cities turned into one of the finest cities in the world. Okay, so there's no great technology involved here. It's very simple. You require to build physical facilities. Okay, just you have to get the water to every household, and a clean drinking water to every household. Okay, and see that the sewage drainage goes out of every house outside the cities and get cleared. Okay, so these are very simple stuff which requires a lot of public investment, will create enormous amount of jobs, and I suppose these are all, and it will lead to positive externality in the entire economy. So this is what is required, and the kind of public health revolution which happened in the advanced countries about 150 years ago, I think we need to have it today. Because India is, as you know, India's public health is one of the worst in the world. And public health indicators, India is really the bottom of the world. Okay, so the way out is that you simply have to make the investments. Okay, that will be my answer. So this is how it may not immediately lead to reduction in poverty, but over a period of time, this will lead to improvement in public health, improvement in health indicators, and improve well-being of people. Okay, that would be my answer. So that's why just simply reading the history of public health is very useful to understand what I'm saying. There's no great technology required. It is simple technology, but it has to be done. That's it.
Okay, sir. So next question is by Tommy, sir. Is it not the right time to boost agriculture by giving due importance, which provides employment for more than 50% of the population?
I can't agree with you more. I agree we require to invest in agriculture. I mean, let me start with basic facts. It is true that today we have overflowing food grain stocks, wheat and rice. We have abundance, we have oversupply of that, and therefore there is there's no emergency with respect to availability of food, like India was about say 3-4 decades ago. India was on the verge of of hunger crisis. India is not in that situation today, thanks to the green revolution we had, and it has spread reasonably all right. So today we have abundance of food stocks in the country from the supply side. Okay, but there is not enough demand for it because people are too poor to demand. Okay, so that's the first problem. So there's enough food grain stocks, but people have no money because they have no employment, or there's no public support for them. So the problem is from that side. There's enough of food grain stocks, but not enough money in the hands of the poorest to demand the food. Okay, that's the first problem. Secondly, our agriculture needs to diversify away from wheat and rice into a variety of other crops, including the pulses and green vegetables. And what's important is India's productivity on all major crops is far below the world's best, or even below the global average. So the notion that India is doing well in agriculture is a very limited statement. If you really want to meet the health or say nutritional requirement of the population, not just the demand for food, the needs of the population, India needs to produce more food grains, and not just food grains, but a variety of agricultural products. So I agree with you that India, there's a lot India needs to do with agriculture, but it has to move away from wheat and rice into a variety of other things, which will lead to overall increase in productivity. So therefore, agriculture is not as a spent force. There's a huge potential agriculture which needs to be addressed, and I agree that it needs to be done.
Sir, okay, sir. Due to time constraints, I guess we would like to wind up the session right now. I'm sorry for all the two people who asked the questions, but due to lack of time, we couldn't accumulate you. accommodate you. So, to end this session, I would like to invite Richie sir to say the vote of thanks.
Honorable dignitaries, respected principal, head of the department, colleagues, and dear participant. Good evening to all. It's my proud privilege to propose vote of thanks on this very significant occasion of the 6th Professor C.O. Abraham Memorial Lecture. On behalf of Department of Economics, St. Berkman's College, I feel immense pleasure to thank our eminent chief guest and resource person, Dr. R. Nagaraj, senior professor at IGIDR Mumbai, who spared his valuable time to grace this program with an extremely relevant address on post-COVID economic growth challenge. He talked about the economic situations of our country, started with the pre-COVID economic situation and a critical and economic analysis of government's response to the crisis, including the structural reforms and the new labor code. He has given us insight into the current problem of aggregate demand and the urgent need for increasing public spending, and also about not V, but K-shaped economic recovery. Let me express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Tommy Verghese, sir, former head, Department of Economics, UC College, Alua, for sharing his memory about late Professor C.O. Abraham, sir. I especially thank our principal, Dr. Jacob Matthews, sir, for his unfaltering support and motivation all throughout. My sincere gratitude also goes to Head of the Department, Johnson Joy, sir, and other organizers of the program, Dr. Shinu, sir, Dr. Anila Skaria, and all my other colleagues for taking up this topic that really matters in today's age and time. My deep sense of appreciation and thanks to all the participants who choose to be online with us and attended this program with great enthusiasm and made it a successful event. Once again, on behalf of Department of Economics, St. Berkman's College, I thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Have a wonderful time ahead. Thank you.